Welcome, everyone, to the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker Series. Welcome to the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker Series. My name is Christina Hamilton, the series director. Today, we welcome Ghanaian artist Ibrahim Mahama for our first international transcontinental conversation, focusing on the current exhibition of his work, In Between the World and Dreams, which is physically present in both Ann Arbor and Detroit in 3 locations: in the gallery at the University of Michigan Institute for the Humanities, on the exterior of the U of M Museum of Art building, marking the first outdoor exhibition of Mahama's work in the United States, and in Detroit at the Charles Wright Museum of African American History. In this multi-venue project, Mahama explores global exchange, commerce, and the troubling histories of colonialism and slavery in the Western world. Using the material of jute sacks, which are the remnants and traces that reference the hands of laborers who filled them as they transported goods around the globe. Many of you were introduced to Ibrahim's work here in the fall of 2019 when he gave a solo Penny Stamps talk, whereas today we take a deep dive into how a community project takes shape across international borders with multiple partners in a global pandemic. Hosting the conversation today, Amanda Krugliak, Arts Curator for the U of M Institute for the Humanities and Chief Curator of this project. She will be joined by Ibrahim Mahama, Guest of Honor, appearing via Skype from Ghana, and Ozi Uduma, Assistant Curator of Global Contemporary Art at UMA, Laura DeBecker, Curator of African Art and Interim Chief Curator at UMA, and Neil Barclay, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Charles Wright Museum of African American History. Today, we start with a video which Ibrahim has put together to showcase the physical manifestation of this transcontinental partnership through all of the spaces it has traveled to get here. Then Amanda Krugliak joins us to welcome Ibrahim to the studio via Skype, live from Ghana.
My name is Ibrahim Mahama, a Ghanaian artist who is currently living and working in Tamale, Ghana. For some years now, I've been very much interested in using the failures of history through specific material conditions as a starting point for artistic interventions around the city.
Qua c'è un altro auto senza filo.
Questo qua là. Questo bianco, sì.
Maybe we can just convince them to throw a party at the apartment. Yeah. They wanted to do that at some point. Hey Jacob, can you take a...
This is more like the photos that you sent to me. Is like a game. That's absolutely amazing.
Hi, everybody. It's so great to see you today. I'm Amanda Krugliak. I'm the curator at the University of Michigan Institute for the Humanities Gallery and also the curator for this project. And now we get to talk to artist Ibrahim Mahama live, coming to us from Accra, Ghana. Hello, Ibrahim.
Hello, how are you?
Ibrahim, I was thinking how originally the project felt like something we were going to just do in the gallery, something that felt more institutional. And as everything shifted around, of course, it became an imperative that it really be something that served community, and what could we do with that? And I wondered if you could talk more about what the project has felt like for you in this shifting plane that it finds itself in.
Oh, thank you. I think, yeah, for me, from the very beginning when we started discussing the project, of course, I do remember we had a number of ideas that were planning to work on. And one of the ideas was always to maybe either do the work within the gallery or to find, let's say, a public space in Ann Arbor. And I remember I discussed the idea of doing extending the project in Detroit because I wanted the work somehow to connect to Detroit as a city and the history that it comes with because of the history of the material that I work with. But I think due to COVID and me not being able to travel, the communication that we had online and finally arriving at the museum on campus, I thought it was quite exciting. And the process of acquiring or obtaining this material, I think, was also quite interesting because maybe there were materials that had been used for other projects in the past, like from the Venice and other projects. So it's been actually a long time since I did one of these massive projects, aside the work that I did earlier this year in Sydney. So for me, it was also quite a new learning experience to somehow rethink about how this the aesthetics of this work could appear to be. And of course, working with you and the team and then trusting that a lot of the decisions that you make, though I'm not around or a studio assistant, everything would go on smoothly. I thought it was quite interesting. I really quite loved this process. Being able to leave the responsibility to someone else to somehow
I
shoulder
think
it.
we've talked about it too, just the fact we could make something happen, you know, to feel that we were committed to making this happen in this moment when everything seemed impossible. And to have a connection to each other at a time when it feels like we can't travel and there's no way to be close, that the project, and interestingly, also this material that we've used in the project, for me, offered that connection, and I think to so many. So that is profound about this project. Trying to do something, and the fact it actually came to be, right? It's amazing.
Yes, I totally agree. Because there have been many instances where before COVID, when travel was all possible, where I made many visits to the States regarding specific projects, outdoor projects, which took several years and never happened.
Yeah.
So I was particularly surprised that this one worked out, even within this period. Yes.
One of the things about your project and your practice is your commitment to community, and this project has played itself out for us as a community. So I thought it would be a good time to check in with Ozzy Udema, who's the assistant curator at UMA, the Museum of Art at the University of Michigan. And perhaps you can talk a little more with Ozzy about community and your practice.
So it has been said that we are in a very unprecedented moment, to the point of cliche, but we are in a very unprecedented moment given COVID-19, protests that are happening not only in this country, but all other parts of the world. And also Ghana is in its own state of a presidential election that's coming in less than 2 months, if I'm not mistaken. And so
Yes.
given all of this in this unprecedented moment we find ourselves in, how are you doing and how has your role as an artist in the community shifted as a result of this unprecedented moment?
Well, I've been telling people that I felt quite lucky because before COVID, I was traveling so much. Almost every week, I was flying somewhere else
Wow. Okay.
for a meeting or for a site visit because of the nature of work I do. I always have to travel to places for research and then also just to see the spaces and decide what form the work takes. But I haven't actually been anywhere since the last trip I made was to Sydney.
Okay.
That was in February. And after I returned, I've been in Ghana. And actually, I've had the best time of my life. I think the COVID period has been the greatest time of my life. I have had more time to think, more time to rest, more time to develop my practice and to push forward certain forms that I could only think about in a symbolic sense, but now I could realize them in an actual sense. So for me, it's been interesting, and also just staying at home, being in Ghana, has given me more time to actually work within the community that I find myself, because I have been doing a lot of work with kids, because the two institutions I built in Tamale were specifically to allow for children in the community to have access to art that normally they wouldn't find there, that they would have to go to the capital city in Accra. So I basically had the time to be able to have a great impact within the period.
So I want to switch gears to talking about your practice. Currently, you are best known for draping buildings with these old jute sacks. But what many people might not know is that you studied painting and sculptural work at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, and you recently received your PhD in painting and sculpture. Am I correct?
Yet to.
Oh, yet to. Okay, so you're a very busy person. So, but it will happen. It will happen. But
Yes.
what has your training in painting and sculpture taught you, or what was the catalyst of moving from painting and sculpture to these public installations where we see these old jute sacks draped over various types of buildings?
Well, I think one of the biggest credits I always give is that my training at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, particularly within the art school, the art college. I did painting and sculpture because I wanted to be an artist, but the curriculum that we were using before in the older generation was based on the old British model of the hand and eye. And then the generation before us, there were a group of professors led by one of the professors, Dr. Karikacha Seidu, who proposed actually changing the curriculum. Because before, if you were a student, you couldn't use, let's say, technology or biochemistry or physics or mathematics as a starting point to make your artwork. But they wanted to open it in such a way that anything could be possible. Because if you look at the history of art, I think it's sometimes a bit disturbing to think that an artist can only practice by using the human figure as a starting point. Before, in the older system, you had the best way they could judge you by being an artist was to be able to, the closest rendition you could have to the human body. But we were thinking about how we could expand art beyond art itself to a point that even art cannot recognize itself. So in my work, like many other students, were encouraged to go out of the context of art to look for inspiration elsewhere. So I started visiting old spaces, bridges, factories, railways, market spaces, finding ways in which the subject matter which we're going to use for art was, one, going to be inspiring, and two, it wasn't going to be separate from the work when it was completed. So then a painting which is done with oil and canvas, by all means, it has to end up in a museum with certain conditions. But if you allow for other materials to inspire you from the market, maybe you can select those objects, which can also lead you into making those paintings. But because of the conditions in which these materials are coming from, like the jute sacks, they can survive anywhere. So for instance, I can have an exhibition suddenly in a market space, the same work can hang in a museum. So it doesn't really take away the subject matter from it. So a lot of the early installations, I concentrated them on public spaces in Ghana, like in market spaces, where you would literally have to work with the market women and the people who are working in those spaces in order to build the artwork, in order to install the artwork. So at the end of the day, I was more or less interested in expanding the experience of art first and foremost, and secondly, how the work could travel from its context to other contexts, like coming to Michigan, and then traveling from there to another space, and somehow accumulating new stories, new residues. And sometimes some of those works would end up going to Western institutions, and the capital that is generated out of it comes back, let's say, into building the institutions that I'm working on in Ghana.
So much of that speaks to accessibility and the ways in which community members are also able to not only be an audience, but also participate in this work, in your process. And so listening to you right now, and also listening to the various interviews that you've given, community exchange and dialogue seem very integral to your process as an artist, which I find refreshing, because so much of artist interviews, it's all about the individual person, the individual process. And so I'm wondering how your training or even your life experiences growing up in Tamale really impacted how you approach a very collaborative nature in your art making process.
Well, I think first and foremost, I come from a polygamous family. So my father is married to 4, and we have many children. So you never really have your personal space. We are more of a community, and it's an extended family. I have so many cousins, and we all live together in like one house. So I remember when you used to come to my father's house, it was like a boarding school with all these kids around. Also going to growing up and going to like all the public schools, you have to learn to share, and also what is someone's problem is your problem or your issue. So there's always been this sense of community within the context that I grew up in. But when I went to art school and uni, and I learned that in the history of art, you cannot separate labor and also the given conditions of how art is made and the production systems away from the object that is created. I thought I found it quite profound. Like, for instance, going into, let's say, Max or Walter Benjamin, and you realize that at the end of the day, if you think that the object that is made and also the artist's genius, that is what somehow concludes an artwork, then it becomes a bit problematic. So why can't we look at the community in which we find ourselves in? After all, life is a gift, because a lot of the projects that I've done, I could have never done them without the support of the community, because a lot of the exchanges, collecting things, objects from here and there, all of those things, they require a massive amount of support. So if you want to make art, then you have to really think about the total experience. Right. So for me, I think I heavily rely on what is there already in the community. There's so much generosity. People are willing to help. Even though you're making an artwork which they do not really understand, they want to see the possible outcome. I remember one of the first experiences was when I started collecting the jute sacks from the market spaces in Accra. And there were a group of people there who were very superstitious. They would say, oh, but why does he want these jute sacks? They're very personal objects to us. What if he takes it for some kind of voodoo or black magic? And then there were other people, marketmen, who said, no, but like, he's a university student. He's doing a research work. Why don't you give him a chance? Let him do what he's doing. Let's see what a possible outcome is. And they were very, very helpful in realizing, actually, without those communities coming together, I would have probably never developed this work to the point of developing the kind of practice that I have today. So it's very important.
So the way I came to learn and understand art was the idea that art could be used as a catalyst for social change. And given the context, so we have the Black Star Lines, which is an art space and a research space in Kumasi. We have Ano Ghana in Accra, which also acts as both an art space and a research space and a space for knowledge production in Accra, which was founded by Nana Aforiata Ayim, who was also the curator of the Ghana Pavilion at the 2019 Venice Biennale, which you participated in. And now we have the Savannah Center for Contemporary Arts in Tamale. And to me, these art spaces represent what the future of art could look like. Spaces that are accessible to community, that are community-centered, art as social practice, and the prioritization of the knowledge production of the people in the country. And so first, for our audience, I would love for you to explain what the Savannah Center for Contemporary Arts is and why you decided to establish it in Tamale and what the future of that space looks like.
The Savannah Center for Contemporary Art is basically like an artist-run space. I built it in 2000 and I started building it in 2014. It only opened last year in March. It's a space that I built originally as a studio space to work as an artist, but later I decided that I was going to turn it into an institution, which was going to be dedicated to retrospectives of older artists practicing from Ghana or within the region. So the first artist that we worked with was called Kofi Dawson, who is an 80-year-old artist who's been working for over 60 years, but his work has never really been put into any context or retrospective. So SCCA is dedicated to those retrospectives. So a month ago, we opened another retrospective of an artist, Ajiman Osei, which we had 3 curators for some of my colleagues from the university. So basically, the idea was to establish this institution that would give our generation a different access point into art. First and foremost, to be able to look into like the art that our older generation did and somehow recontextualize it properly, to be able to publish on it, to be able to work on it. When you have young artists coming together to work on older artists' works, I think it gives them a different sense of responsibility regarding their own practice. This year, we opened another space called Red Clay, which is an extension of the SCCA. And this is a different institution altogether, which actually relies on like expanding the spaces. So for instance, a lot of work which I've done end up in museums around the world. But I've always also asked myself this question: why can't I build an institution at home which the younger generation can have access to the work that I produce, which will be in New York, or which will be in Miami, or which will be in London, or anywhere? So we have like these spaces dedicated to the collection of my own work and also the collection of other collections that we are building. And we also have like a school which we're using to educate kids. I use a lot of drone in my work to photograph and document the work that I do. So I started doing these drone classes with some of the kids in the community, with some of my colleagues in Tamale. So currently we are doing these drone workshops with them, where we've combining the inside of the airplanes that I bought 2 years ago and transported there. We're combining the cockpit together with the drone technology. So the future of the space is going to be concentrated more on dedicating it as a space for pedagogical work and research, educating kids. Because for me, the most important thing is to be able to build a space in a community, not within the center, but almost at the edge, where it can give the kids in that community a different sense of themselves and their place within the world, and also further expand their imagination. Because I believe a lot of the problems that we have in the world today is due to ideological conflict, one, and secondly, due to the lack of imagination. So if we can resolve these 2 things, I think we will have a generation that will emerge in the future to resolve some of the crises that we're dealing with today.
I want to focus on this idea of crisis and failure. You talk a lot about crisis, decay, and failure, which I find very fascinating and also slightly terrifying, because so much of our world is all about perfection and order, and anything that talks about failure, decay, or crisis should immediately be thrown out. You know, I reflect on these ideas as 2020 represents a very big anniversary on the continent, as this being the kind of celebration of the Year of Africa. Many countries on the continent they're celebrating their 60th birthday or 60th year as a democracy. I know Ghana received their independence in 1957, so you all are very much ahead of the curve. But I reflect on this idea, and especially since so many of these countries are, dealing with protests as recently as this weekend. This whole idea of the promise of independence and the ways in which that promise fell short. And so many conversations from this generation talks about the failure of our leaders and the dreams deferred as a result to the violence and insecurity and, military coups. But when I think about your work in terms of failure and decay, you see it as this process of rebirth, at least as how I've interpreted it. Rebirth, renewal, and the opportunities to find a new beginning in decay and crisis. And we see that in your artwork with the abandoned airplanes, turning them into classrooms, or into your Ghost of Parliament, where you focus on the failed histories and ghosts as it connects to crisis. And you create a literal pool of ideas with the hope of reimagining what the future could look like. And so I know this might be a very big question, but in this moment, going back to the first question around this unprecedented moment and the failures of this moment, what possibilities do you see that can emerge from the failures and the crises that we're currently dealing with?
I think the world has been in a crisis since the industrial age. So we really have to look at new ways of living, new ways of coexisting, new ways of reorganizing capital. And in Ghana, at least from an artistic point of view, I try to do it by trying to use the contradictions that capital or my work even poses, because there is nothing that says that a jute sack, which probably is worth nothing in the market, that you take an exchange and you turn into an artwork, which converts, let's say, into a few $100s. How do you account for that money? And that's what capital has always done. The surplus and excess capital that has always been generated out of the resources or the earth that we've generated. What have we done with those amounts of monies? Is it just a way of hoarding and somehow enriching individuals and lives, rather than using it to somehow reorganize the world and trying to make it a much better place? So I've been thinking quite a lot. I think it's really important that we use this moment as a time to really reflect on the conditions that we find ourselves in and ways in which we can escape it into a much more certain future.
Ibrahim, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to your brilliance and your complete generosity. So I really appreciate it.
Now I'd like to move to another part of the project that is critical, the public-facing installation at UMA at the University of Michigan. And I'd like to introduce you to my collaborator of that project, Laura De Becker. She's the chief curator at UMA and also the curator of African art. Hi, Laura.
Hi.
It's just fantastic to have you. I keep thinking that we've all been in our separate little bubbles throughout this, and then this is an opportunity for all of us to actually meet and come together. And you and I especially have really been working on this throughout. So it's good to have you back in my corner.
Yep, partners in crime.
I thought that we could talk about this particular piece, which initially had not been part of the idea a year ago. And then as we closed as a university and COVID-19 defined all of our experiences and there were no galleries open, it became clear that the museum was going to be closed to the public. We had protests about labor on campus, protests in the country in support of Black Lives Matter. And it felt that suddenly this project could offer an opportunity, could respond in a way that we hadn't considered before. And so at that point, the thought of doing a public-facing installation on UMA felt like that would be a really important piece of this. And we started this conversation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It came, I don't know if it came at the perfect time, maybe that's the wrong way to put it, but it took on all these new connotations and meanings because of the time that we managed to actually install it. And for us, it was a rare opportunity to still make art accessible to our audiences, to the students, at a time that it is hardly or very difficult to access in any case safely. But it also was about, as you said, it sort of took on a life of its own because of all of the context that was happening around it. And it became, for me, this really interesting metaphor for, and you've mentioned it in the conversation before, but for connections, because we had to work together in ways that many people in academia and even in the museum world are not trained to do so, but very collaboratively at a time, again, that meeting face-to-face was impossible, so that posed an extra layer of challenge. And those connections were spectacular, and they ranged from literally in person, getting together and sewing bags,
Right.
to spending the week on site while the piece was going up, and that whole experience was just so powerful because you could see it grow. And again, I thought that was so nice to make that a public experience for our audiences as well. To all of the conversations we've had around it, and will have over the next month. And I think it's already proven to be a real conversation starter in the community.
I think in the past, and for those people who don't work at the university, to understand the different ways that different institutions work. And although we're partners or we're generous with one another, it's very difficult under normal circumstances for us to come together and work in this way. It's easy to become siloed.
Yeah.
And so this idea that a moment like this opened this crevice, right? It opened this place for light to come in, for something to become possible that might otherwise not have been if things were normal, right?
Yeah.
A time when the museum often schedules far out, or the Institute may be more focused on something that we're doing across campus. We have different audiences, and although we crisscross, it's not always that way that we can line up in the way that we did. So that was really special. As colleagues, I've always wanted to work with you, and certainly we've talked about doing things together institutionally, but it never has quite lined up.
Yeah.
And then just the process you spoke of that people might not be aware of, from first these 100-pound, 300-pound coils of burlap arriving on skids, trying to figure out where to put them, having to sew them. Normally, we would have been able to call upon community or students to help us. And here we all are, masked up, sneaking out on a weekend to try to sew these panels and measure them properly so they'll fit on the facade of that STED building.
Yep.
All of these meetings we had to have with engineers and the safety commissions, and hiring a structural engineer, so that what seemed like, let's just put Ibrahim's work on the facade, became this really intricate system and a whole new territory for us to negotiate all of the regulations, the fire, the safety, the construction, the signs, you know, we could go on and on.
Yeah.
And that was a daily commitment that even in the face of seemingly this coming apart. So again, this metaphor, much like Ibrahim's work, that it felt like at any moment this could come apart, come undone, unravel. And it required, I felt, at a certain point, we would check in the morning or we would be texting and I would just need to hear your voice. Like, today I'm going to visualize the piece on
Yep.
Uma and we will manifest it.
Yeah.
And that felt like what ultimately got us to the other side. I don't know if it felt that way to you, but.
Absolutely. I think the name of the piece is so accurate in so many ways, In Between the World and Dreams, because it felt like that too. It was that crevice that we had to keep open and keep fighting to have it up. And I also wanted to mention, because I think Ibrahim will really like this, how we had to reach out to all of the other institutions that have displayed his work before or have tried and failed to display his work before, which has happened, to ask for their advice about staining and weatherproofing and fireproofing and all of the practical questions that we didn't know were coming our way when embarking on this project. And I just love that that the work itself is this amalgamation of pieces that have been shown before in Venice and in Sydney, and I think they came from LA and Vancouver, if I'm not mistaken. So they physically came from all of these pieces, but then we also had to access all of that knowledge to help us make it a reality.
I want to bring in Ibrahim because he's been on my phone, but you haven't actually been in the conversation, Ibrahim. So this is Laura, of course, you've met, and we want to bring you in to ask you about how this compares to other installations. Have you had some of these same challenges, or where does it fit into the bigger picture of putting your work up?
I'll say this was, I think, one of the best projects done. And I say that truthfully because I just literally couldn't believe that it happened, particularly in this period. Because I said to myself, maybe it will not happen, because even when there was no crisis, we couldn't manage to pull it together. So there's always like something that prevents it from happening. And I guess it's because one of the challenges has been that people have always been afraid about, one, the context of the work, because the work is very political in terms of what it speaks to us. And secondly, also as a material, it looks like something which is falling apart. I remember one of the major projects we're doing in the US, there was always a complaint about the fact that the material could somehow, the residues, let's say the beans or the dust that was in the material, could contaminate the soil. And I said, really? I thought there was a lot of oil that was spilling into the ocean, like this is not going to do anything. I never really quite understood some of the excuses for not allowing some of the projects to pass. And also like working with engineers to be able to like design like the safety measures around the project, and not getting approval because they maybe the city felt it was not good enough, or things like that. So for me, it's always been, and sometimes even like some of the projects I've done in Ghana, they are not related to bureaucracy. It's just because maybe there are squatters or people living in the space, and if by doing the project, it means that it's going to affect their being within the place. And sometimes you just have to compromise and say, okay, fine, I'm not going to do this. So for me, it's just been interesting to see how this has unfolded, particularly within this time, because I thought that it will really be a test to see what the possibility of it can be. And I think it's been wonderful, the form it's taken.
I wish you could be here to see how this work challenges the buildings around it. That forever, I will never look at the canvas in the same way again. That piece may be temporary, but the way that it has shifted the hierarchy of buildings and what that infers, that will forever be in our minds.
Yes.
And whether you get out of your car or you don't, and you see this from the street, it's just changed the picture. Would you say?
Yeah, I wanted to mention, Ibrahim, I had the really great pleasure of seeing your work on I think it's the National Theatre in Accra, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, really?
Yes, I was in Accra for a conference and I happened upon it. I was not expecting it to be there. I was headed elsewhere, and I think an encounter like that with a piece like that it's almost the best kind, because if you're not expecting it, it makes you stop and look at everything around you anew.
Absolutely. And when I go by Ibrahim many times a day to check on the piece. Yes. I feel like I have to be vigilant about making sure it's all right, and I miss this piece. And as students are walking by it, they're looking up, and they're just looking up, that they have a reason, right, to look up and to think about this and to reflect and to ask these questions. And just to see that has been so inspiring. I think giving us that space to think, to reflect, to imagine at a time when it's so challenging, and there aren't that many of those public spaces to do that. I'm so glad that you joined us to talk about this. And before we introduce our next guest, we're able once again to see the beautiful Savannah Center for Contemporary Art in Ghana.
The idea of building this studio in a rural setting rather than building it at the very heart of the city. So it's just to give opportunity to people living in those spaces. We're currently walking through the corridor that leads to the Parliament of Ghosts. I like the way it's somehow, with the scaffolding, it almost acts as if you're walking through this forest. There's something really poetic about it. I guess sometimes the construction process for me is even much more interesting than the than actual finished building or product. The Parliament of Ghosts was originally conceived for the Manchester International Festival. Prior to it, it was conceived just as a theatrical space, something which I had wanted to design for the studio in order to allow members of the community and all the villagers to come together to be able to have meetings, discussions, and also to be able to watch films together. But when I was invited to produce the work for the Manchester International Festival, I decided to produce the Parliament of Ghosts. Later on, I decided I was going to conceive the work as an essential part of the studio in Tamale. So it acts as a central space to the entire institution. So we're going to be having lectures, seminars, film screenings, and a lot of different activities right here. So it's not just a studio which the artist is going to use for the making of objects, but it's also going to be a place which is going to be used for rethinking and reshaping history, and also the cultural norms and values within the space and community. So the Parliament of Ghosts acts as a center within all of this, which somehow allows the audience or the people within the community to rethink about the histories which they possess and how they function within it. I think it's very important for artists, particularly artists coming from spaces which are outside the so-called center of the art world, to be able to at least produce works that again can be situated within the local, that gives people who live there the same opportunities to see things as it happens in Europe and many other places. So this is a residential building which I purchased, which was just around the studio when I started building it. Originally, when I started working on the studio, the land was quite empty. none of these buildings existed. Later on, there were other people who came to settle because people are fond of just buying land and not developing it for a longer period. So I somehow negotiated with the neighbors, and then we came to an agreement because I wanted to expand the studio and be able to at least provide spaces for visiting artists and also like colleagues, and also just being able to create room for all the different people that would come to visit, and also foster that idea of a community building. Labor is very essential to whatever we are doing, so we focus a lot on it. The people who help us to build, I think it's very important for us to think about that in relation to what the idea of any institution can be, because we tend to focus so much on what we want to do, and we pay very little attention to those who actually build these things. So within this pandemic period, I think it's very important that it allows us to reflect on the conditions that we've created in the world and how we can use the paradoxes of capital somehow to be able to bring new life back into the world and the society around us.
Just seeing the footage again of the Savannah Center for Contemporary Art in Tamale that Ibrahim has created as part of his practice reminds me of this focal point of all that we're doing, what community means and how art and artists can impact and empower community. And that brings me to our next special guest and my partner and collaborator in this project, In Between the World and Dreams. Today we have director Neil Barkley. He's the director of the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit. Welcome, Neil.
Great to be here. Thank you.
The part of the project at your gallery is very different from the other two. It's an interior installation, and it's in the community gallery. And I know that talking to Ibrahim, and we can talk more to him through this conversation, that has felt for him a real touchstone of the project, as closely aligned to his own in thinking about what his work might offer in the museum.
Yeah, I think it's such a great place for it. When I first came, I wanted to make sure that the Wright had a place to accept projects that were generated by the community, specifically the community of artists and historians in Detroit. But I also wanted that room to be able to have a conversation with artists working around the world. So this really did come at a great time to kind of add that dimension to the work that we want to do there, right? And the notion of having an interior installation of the work, given how it's been seen in other places, was also fascinating to me because I think the materiality of it, the material that he's using, will also have resonance within our community because some of those jute bags and things like that also find their way here, right? So I think it's just a great project for us right now. Yeah.
I think that Charles Wright, too, this is true of everyone you talk to, that it's a place that is very important to generations of people and something that people talk about as visiting when they were children and then throughout their lives. And so that for me, too, the same way that Ibrahim's center feels to be about this play and education and bringing young people, creating a space for them to think of new ideas, that the Wright is like that as well, that it's not separated out, museified. And throughout this process, I thought that was an important piece, that his work ultimately for me should exist within the everyday, right? Within the world.
That's absolutely right. Yeah,
yeah.
it's. I mean, the right is increasingly a kind of gathering place, isn't it? It replaces the town hall and cities of old. You know, where people come together to experience culture and work, and you know, it's a place where, you know, some of our most revered African Americans have lied in state. You know, it's a place where communities have, you know, all kinds of, you know, we rent the facility, there are all kinds of people throughout the community. And so, you know, using it thinking about it, I guess, as this kind of place where people come together to experience different things as a community. Right now, in this period, it's obviously very difficult to do because a lot of us can't congregate in one space at one time. But I do think that the right is a very special place in that regard. And I've worked at several museums, and they all don't have this sort of imprimatur of being a place of community, right?
Sure.
And the right has that very, very distinctly. It really does come out at you as a person that's relatively new to the venue or to the place. You know, it's been almost 2 years now.
Neil, your museum is actually open now.
It is.
Of the 3 institutions that this work is being shown, you're the only one who is head of a museum that's
Right.
open to the public.
Wow.
But can you, what is that, what has been the impact of that, and where are you in that process
Yeah,
right
it's been
now?
very challenging. We've been open since July 10th, so we've been open a while now. And, you know, we're starting to see more people come out, right? But we have a very strict sort of reservation system. Only so many people can come in at a certain time, which has really restricted the number of people that can be in the facility, right? And so, for example, we just opened an exhibition on voting, right? Voting, very topical subject, a lot of interest in that. And it's also interesting to have it with Ibrahim's work here because it brings it into the contemporary moment, right?
Yeah.
As well. But at any rate, it's been tricky to navigate all of the COVID restrictions and distancing and, you know, all the things that have to happen in the museum space. It's such a big space, and yet we're limited to a very small number of people that can be in. So it's been challenging, but I'm glad to see people are coming out, and, you know, we are actually at capacity at what we can do, right?
Yeah.
So in other words, our reservations are filling up daily, so that's good. Right.
And I think even when we were just there installing, I worked with Patrina Chapman, who's
She's
a
amazing.
wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful curator there.
Yeah.
And just even the installation, how she and I have been having to go through this process of when we can be together, when we can't. And it was really during the installation, and Ibrahim, I wanted you to hear this as well, that during that installation, suddenly we were working with your staff, and the whole piece became itself as we're doing it. In a way, the whole project became itself. So suddenly we were working on something together and understood again the way that we became connected through the installation.
Yep. And that room is very special for us in that way because it is a space for us to collaborate with different kinds of community groups to realize projects, not all artistic projects, you know, sometimes on health issues or, you know, other kinds of issues that are prominent in the community. But it is really that space where that kind of chemistry can happen between projects and ideas and people and community, you know. So that's the idea that we had for it. It's almost like a lab in that way, you know, that we experiment with different ways of animating community, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Animating it. I
Yeah.
do. I feel like it activated
Yep, absolutely.
the
Yeah, it
space
does.
and immediately feels different to me
Yeah.
than some other kind of exhibition
Sure.
space.
Oh, very much so in our context too, because we have a set exhibit, as you know, the core exhibit, and then we have these changing exhibits. But we don't do a lot of kind of installation-based work, and I think this will be really beautiful for people to see as a kind of introduction to what that practice is about. You know.
It's interesting too that you brought up the voting project, and at UMA, Ibrahim, there's also a voting project that's going on in the base of that museum, and your piece shrouds that part of the the building. And it did feel absolutely and intentionally that there was a way these two themes would overlap in this moment, and what that meant to vote, and what Ibrahim's work means in regards to equality.
Equality and empowerment, and how we make the common special, in our minds and in our hearts, right? Yep. All of that.
That this space, this mutual space, and what voting can really do to ensure that, I guess.
Yeah, the voting exhibition's interesting because it really just tells you about what it took to have that right, in our society. And so, when you see that material, it's like, why wouldn't I vote?
Sure.
And I think that, Ibrahim's work has a similar emotional power. When you see it, you get the sense of past, the present, a future, possibility, beauty of it, in a different way for sure, but it does come through in that work. And so they're really great companions. I was really happy to see how they relate to one another in different ways. Yeah.
Ibrahim, I think of the Right as being a place that really honors tradition and African American history and the importance of mentors and the strength from previous generations. And I thought perhaps you could talk about how you think about conjuring up ghosts in your work, that your work is really about past, present, and future, and what the idea of conjuring ghosts means.
I think the question of ghosts has always been within my work in the choice of materials. I started working with the jute sacks because I somehow believed that they had all these ghosts within them via the people who used them or the history that it came from. Because these materials are traditionally made in India and in Bangladesh, and when they're brought to Ghana, they're used in the transportation of cocoa mainly. And then afterwards, they are sold to traders in the markets who use it to bag maize, charcoal, and other things. But eventually the material gets to a point where it becomes so stained that it can no longer be used to carry these food items. And that is where I become interested in it, because I think that at that point, it is somehow multi-layered with all the global values, the contradictions of capital and everything, the conditions of the people who produce these commodities, the labor values and all that. But when you somehow take it as a work, as an artistic work, and you reinterpret it by sewing it together with maybe certain specific labor forms or community, there is a new form of interpretation that comes to it. And that is, I thought that was quite interesting. And secondly, also, because of the relationship that it might have to architecture and other materials, both historically and also in the present, when you combine these two things. So for instance, when you combine the material with the museum or the Charles Wright, there is a new conversation that begins to emerge, and I'm particularly interested in those conversations and what they bring about. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to just end this all thinking about conceptually the idea of dreams and how Ibrahim's work and the whole project In Between the World and Dreams. What does that mean when we talk about dreams?
Well, I think in one of the footages that I sent was of our classes with the kids, with the airplanes. With the drones within the airplanes and connecting those two forms. And I always made a comment that you would never really think that the contradiction of capital with regards to the money or the funding that is earned through my work through, let's say, the jute sacks, is somehow enabling these kinds of new imaginative forms or dreams to emerge. So I'm only, so dreams are very important. When we look into these materials, I think that for me it's important for us to be able to look beyond them, to be able to look into them, to imagine that the ghost that we are talking about can somehow re-inspire us to maybe think of the future anew with new tools.
That's awesome.
I know, right?
Beautifully put. Yeah.
It's just wonderful to have you here, Neil, today.
Thank you. I
And
loved it.
part of this conversation.
Yeah,
Thank you so
so
much
much.
for being our
Yeah,
partner.
yeah. And Ibrahim, thank you for bringing this work to us. We really appreciate it. Hopefully one day you'll be able to be here with us when your work is shown. It's amazing.
Certainly. Thank you very much.
It's a
I feel
pleasure.
very
Yeah.
honored.
Yeah.
Thanks to all our wonderful guests today. And thanks especially to Ibrahim Mahama, who came to us from Ghana, and to his generosity and all that he offered us in making this project happen, even though he wasn't able to be here in person. And thanks to all of you for joining in. Take care.